the way in which it operates is, of course, that we have been providing those resources to the Ukrainians themselves. How far we got involved in the detail of the planning, I think, is harder to judge. We do provide them with intelligence support, but there's a break between that and the direct targeting. So we're not necessarily involved in specific targets. I think if they came back to us and said, given the sort of technical capabilities of the weapon system you provided, would that be an optimum fit? I think we might give them some advice on that basis, but we're not sitting there doing the direct targeting of Russian assets. That's not our role. They use a variety of systems, and they become very clever at using what they think is the right system to deal with the right target. The phraseology which the military use, which is often uncomfortable, they talk about prosecuting targets, which is a kind of slightly euphemistic way of saying engaging those targets. But every target, or even target set, and there could be a number of targets in a particular area, have got particular problems, whether it be problems with navigation, defences in the region, range, payload, all those sort of things we take into account. So part of the targeting process is not just identifying what is the target, but it's also how should you prosecute that target? It's how do you get at that particular target? And the conclusion clearly that's come to on this particular occasion that the NIAD drones, British supplied and supported, were the right weapon systems for this particular target set. Well, first of all, we should recognise that whenever that something happens, that they can point backwards to Britain, that we tend to get this kind of really hyperbolic, aggressive and violent language coming back, threatening consequences. It's happened on a number of occasions in the past, where they've sort of seen the hand of Britain directly involved in something that's happened inside Russia itself. At every stage when we provided the Ukrainians with major weapon systems, they've threatened dire consequences. This is normal from them. So one aspect, one reaction to that would be just to discount it and to say this is kind of business as usual. In this instance, what they've threatened are severe consequences, and they've also kind of encouraged some of the wilder voices and wilder people around the Kremlin to talk about use of nuclear weapons. Again, part of the kind of the Russian threat spectrum that comes back. He talked about using nuclear-armed torpedoes beside nuclear-armed torpedoes, and in the past they've talked about firing a missile which they call Satan to drop nuclear weapons into the Irish Sea, creating tidal waves that would sweep across Britain. I mean, that's the kind of language they use, and I don't think that's necessarily to be taken seriously directly. However, and there's a couple of big howevers. Firstly, I think it does indicate how angry they are. So they do see this as a substantive change. And the second point is they do react. They do things about it. Now, sometimes it can be a sort of more of like a demonstration. You'll recall 3 or 4 weeks ago, again, we irritated them, and a Russian destroyer in the English Channel started firing fairly randomly and appeared to threaten a British yacht that was sailing across the channel without warning. It was legal what they did, but hardly the actions of a kind of friendly country. So we could expect some kind of demonstration like that. What we can also expect is that there'll be a more direct reaction, and here they'll use the whole panoply, the whole range of instruments at their disposal. So we would expect to see, for example, an uptick in the use of their spy trawlers over our submarine cables. We'd expect to see aggressive cyber operations being employed against us, information operations, subversion, and anything up to sabotage. And we've had assassinations on our soil. That's part of the range. So that will happen, and that's to be expected when you're dealing with Russia, because that's part of their language, how they operate. I think what even more concerning, though, is whether or not the kind of aggressive, violent language is misinterpreted by one of Putin's subordinates, because one of the challenges we've got to deal with them is this: that there's a sort of vision sometimes of Putin sitting there like Blofeld in the James Bond films, stroking his cat and then ordering things to happen. It doesn't always work like that. What you see much more often is a sort of decentralized and deregulated approach, whereby the general idea, the general intent is pushed out by Putin, and then he leaves subordinates to get on with it from there. And that has a danger that they won't aim under in doing what they'll do. They may do something which they think is fulfilling what Putin wants them to do, but gives him plausible deniability for what is going on. And that's always dangerous when you get this kind of aggressive, hyperbolic language from a senior Kremlin spokesperson. Some of the mechanisms that used to exist as part of the kind of the what were originally put in place as the détente measures, which kind of brought, if you like, a satisfactory to geopolitical end to the Cold War. The hotlines, the limitations on both sides in terms of what they're doing. Some of those protection measures, I think, have disappeared. They may still exist, or they may still exist in sort of minimal form, but that kind of regular conversation, I think, has disappeared, and that's the danger. So it's very hard then to perceive, as you say, against this volume of threats and the volume of noise of aggressive intentions and dire consequences for what we're doing to support the Ukrainians, when they're actually being really serious, or whether what we're hearing is just, as you say, hot air and rhetoric. That's why I think when people analyse the current situation and they compare it back to what's happened, for example, during the Cold War, they say we're in a much more dangerous place than we had been. It's not that the size of the armed forces opposing each other have been because they've been massively reduced, but the kind of understanding of each other that used to exist, even though we were basically opposing each other, I think has disappeared, and we find now very difficult to work out what do they really mean, or whether they really are threatening us, or whether it's just hot air to support their kind of the people who surround the Kremlin. I think that's why people regard it, and we've had it from the Chief of Defence Staff, as saying the most dangerous period in his military career, and I think that's the rationale behind that observation. I think the stop will only come from Putin when they realise that they've kind of pushed us into a place where we can't get away, can't move away from. So they are quite content to allow things like drones crossing into Romania. Airspace violations in the Gulf of Bothnia, regular pushes into British airspace off the northeast coast of Scotland. That's all part of the pattern and kind of business as usual, and indeed has not really changed over many years. What they, I think, are very poor at understanding is the way in which certain elements of NATO are actually beginning to change. We see that in the way in which people like the Poles, the Estonians, Lithuanians, the Latvians, and also the Finns and the Swedes have reacted to what they see as this increased threat profile from Russia. And Putin still talks about NATO being a fundamentally weak organisation, and there are indeed huge stresses and divisions inside NATO. But I think to some extent they underestimate the extent to which we now understand that there is a problem, there is a threat, and are prepared to react to that. Now, it has to be said, in this country, that's not quite the position we're in at the moment. We have a position at the moment where we've got a government that's talking the talk about threats, talking talk about the rhetoric, but doesn't seem to be doing very much about it. And I think that's a division between the rhetoric and the reality that people like Putin are seeking to exploit and to really give themselves a justification for their existence. Because Russia was promised by Putin victories. This is what he was being told was going to happen. That's not what's happened. We don't have great victories. Ukraine did not fall, and the Baltic states and these long-term enemies seem to be building up their strength rather than dividing them. And that makes it an unstable place for Putin, and I think a dangerous place for Putin as well.